The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 6 of the Lunch and Learn series. We're at the end now of our series, so we've covered a lot of territory, haven't we, in the last couple of months. I'm assuming I'm coming across loud and clear. Perhaps we might just do a quick sound check. Could I ask people, please, just in the question box, to just type in the word clear, just make sure, because I'm not actually, I'm in a remote location today. Loud and clear. Thanks, Fraser. That's good to hear. That's reassuring. I'm not talking to myself for an hour, which is also reassuring. Okay, good. No one else? Well, okay, if people haven't responded, it's either because you can't hear me or you can hear me and you just want to move on. Anyway, we'll move on. So, look, it might sound like a very dry topic, this whole notion of facilitating effective meetings, but let's face it, our whole life is one meeting, isn't it? I mean, you could argue this is a meeting, albeit online. When this is over, there'll be another meeting and another meeting. It never ends. And of course, as a leader, you have to, facilitate some of these meetings. And the reality is that we often attend more dull, boring and unproductive meetings than we probably should. So this is about trying to improve our capacity to run effective meetings. And by doing that, of course, you stand out in the crowd because people will notice, of course, if you facilitate an effective meeting. And I think it's one of the skills of leadership that's often untapped, because there is a way of doing it, and it's not rocket science. There's some fairly straightforward things I'm going to share with you, and I think you'll get plenty of tips and hints on how you can improve the way you run your meetings, whether it's with clients, whether it's with customers, whether it's internal, whether it's a project-based meeting, whatever it might be. These principles are pretty applicable right across the board. Okay, so let's move on. Now you can see, of course, the topics we've covered. I won't go back over old ground. You can see what we've covered in the Lunch and Learn series. In Unit 5, of course, we talked about understanding people and their personalities, and hopefully had a chance to do the personality profile, and even to the extent where it might be good to print it off and do it with your team if you haven't already done it, just to get a little bit of levity into the team, and also, I guess, to understand how people like to operate from a personality perspective, because it was all based on the platinum rule about treating people how they want to be treated, rather than the golden rule, which is about treating people how you want to be treated, which can not necessarily work well for you as a leader. And of course, that was your homework. Your homework was around leading with an emphasis on personality type. So the irony about all this, of course, is that the people that you work least effectively with are often opposites. And yet, ironically, it is those people who have opposite perspectives that could actually bring the greatest potential to the project or the task at hand. So whilst it can be a source of annoyance, it can be an enormous source of value as well. But just understanding personality types is a good starting point. So ask any questions as we go through today, and stop me at any time and ask me the questions. And I've just mentioned the fact that this is treating people how they want to be treated, which of course is the platinum rule rather than the golden rule, which is treat everybody how you want to be treated. All right, so let's launch into today and consider what we're actually going to look at. Now, I want to start by talking about the context of meetings. Let's just understand the various reasons that we meet, and often there's multiple reasons that we meet. And so let's be clear about that. What sort of meetings do you run? What sort of meetings do you attend? And what are the reasons for that? I'd also like to talk a little bit around the cost of meetings. If you think about it, the cost of meetings is could be a significant impost on the organisation. And because we spend our life in meetings, and therefore if we're not having productive meetings, then that's a cost on the business or the organisation. So we'll look at the structure of meetings and how you might improve the whole structure of meetings. We'll also look at some of the interpersonal and leadership skills that I think I'd like to share with you in terms of being able to create a better, richer meeting environment. And of course, some other ideas as well to enrich your meetings. So we're covering a lot in a short amount of time. So let's get underway. Excuse me. Now, I sort of alluded to this at the outset, but it is very true in my view that getting good at running productive meetings is one of the most critical and untapped skills of any leader. And I think that, it's not difficult to do either. And there's just a few simple habits that you need to change. And I think to suggest that because you don't attend many productive meetings is not an excuse for you not to run productive meetings when the opportunity arises. So we'll talk about what that looks like. But at the end of the day, I think it's an extremely important skill for the very fact that you spend a lot of time in meetings. And in many of those meetings, of course, you're running. So that's the context, that's the rationale for why we're doing this. So the other perhaps insight about meetings that's important is that meetings themselves are not productive. So it's actually what happens or doesn't happen between meetings that actually determines the effectiveness of a meeting. Have you ever thought about that? In other words, what we do with the information and the decisions that come out of meetings is, in fact, critically important, and that is something that happens between meetings, not during meetings. So meetings are there to inform, meetings are there to educate, and so forth and so on. But what we actually do out of the meeting is the critically important component of whether the meetings are actually effective or not. So it's something to think about. So, of course, what that implies is that we've got to be crystal clear about the outcomes of the meetings and what happens as a result of the meeting. So let's have a look at that a little bit further. So if you consider that, let's try and categorize all the different reasons we have meetings. Some meetings are there to inform people. So there might be a new client, or there might be a new project specification, or there might be some interesting news, there might be a restructuring, whatever it might be. We will often have meetings to inform people about the change. And so the meetings are often, those sort of meetings are very one way, where the leader of the meeting is pretty much giving feedback around what those changes look like and how they might impact on the individuals around the table. So we attend plenty of information meetings, I'm sure you'd agree. We also use meetings to educate people. So this is around learning and development. This is around, any training course, for example, what we're doing today. Of course, the main purpose of this meeting is to educate. So we attend plenty of those sorts of meetings as well. But we also attend meetings to clarify. So sometimes if there's confusion within your team or in the organisation about which way to go, should I use process A or should I use process B, it might require a meeting to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So sometimes meetings can be used to clarify a complex situation, or perhaps even where the ground is shifted, it might be useful to get the team together to explain why the shift has taken place and the implications of that shift. Meetings are also used to engage people. So some meetings are very much a process of getting the participants to do most of the heavy lifting, to get them to talk about their various ideas and so forth. So I'm thinking of a typical project meeting where people are sharing and pooling their ideas about how a particular project or problem can be dealt with. And so what we're trying to do is to use the collective wisdom of the team to be able to make some decisions about what needs to happen. We also use meetings to solve collective problems, and you might suggest, and of course if we're using meetings to solve collective problems, then obviously it's a meeting of engagement as well, because you're expecting everybody to contribute to that problem and the solutions that might be considered. We use many meetings, of course, to review progress, and I know many of you would have weekly, fortnightly or monthly work in progress meetings where each individual, perhaps from a functional area, would explain what they're doing and what progress or lack of they're making in order to achieve whatever it is they have set their mind to achieve. So we have plenty of those meetings, as you know. And then, of course, we have meetings to make decisions. So these meetings are about getting collective or collaborative decision-making processes in place so that the team may all commit to a particular course of action. So there's a consensus in the room of a particular way we should go forward. Now, obviously, when you read that list, you'd be aware, of course, that many of the meetings that we attend have multi-purposes. So it's obvious that some of those things are all combined. But I think my point to you would be that whenever you have a meeting with anybody else, you need to consider, although it might seem common sense, you need to consider very clearly what sort of meeting is this. And then, of course, to communicate to your team once you have that meeting, why we're having that meeting, what is the reason for that. So that's a little bit of a context around that. Now, let me move on a little bit and start talking about a cost of meetings. I mentioned at the outset that meetings cost a lot of money. Now, I would strongly suggest you do a little bit of an audit inside your business unit or your team or your department. You can easily do this, and you can actually quantify the actual cost of running meetings every year. Let me give you some criteria to look at, and you can take this away and perhaps look at this from a homework point of view. So if you can work out what the average income of your team member is, so let's say we've got a small team, let's argue that, you obviously you can work out their annual wage, and then of course you divide it by 52 and then 40 hours or whatever people work. So ultimately you come up with an hourly rate that everybody in the team is on. You could get them to do that for themselves. So, we've got, an hourly rate. Then we work out how many meetings on average does your team members attend a week. Now, they may not be meetings that you're involved in, but these may well be other meetings inside the organisation and beyond the organisation. So you calculate that. Now, some of you, of course, have got access to people's diaries, and of course that can make it very easy, but it's not hard to work out the amount of hours that people will spend on average in meetings each week. And then you work out typically how long does each meeting last. Is it 1 hour? Is it 2 hours? It's normally one or the other. And then you might ask yourself the question, how many people have I got in my team? And then you've got to remember that every time we meet, and we're meeting now, the reality is that you're not doing something else, at least to its full extent. All right, so you see people tinkering away on their iPad and so forth in meetings, but at the end of the day, when you're sitting in a meeting that may last for, say, an hour, it's actually really 2 hours of your time that's taken up. Obviously, 1 hour invested in the meeting itself, but the other hour is what accountants will call an opportunity cost. So this is because you're in that meeting for an hour, you can't attend to something else, or at least not give it your full attention. So it's really 2 hours every time you meet. So that's important when you calculate the cost of meetings with your team. So let's put some numbers around that just to give this some context. Let's assume, and these are fairly conservative figures, let's assume that you've worked out that it's $31.25 per hour per person in your team on average. So you've kind of got a baseline of the cost for an hour with one of your team members. Let's also assume that every team member has 5 meetings a week. which I don't think is unreasonable. So, 5 meetings a week is on average what your team members would have individually, that is, not collectively. And then you can work out how long each meeting lasts. Now, I've just put a figure here, but 2 hours, let's say the average is 2 hours, which basically equates to 10 hours a week in meeting time per person. So we've now established what the cost is per person, and we've established the number of hours that people attend meetings during the week. So the next question, of course, is how many you've got in your team. And let's assume you've got 6 people in your team, including yourself. So I've got a team of 6, and these are the figures on a team of 6. And in terms of the opportunity costs, whatever figure you come up with, you double, because of course, as I mentioned, that the opportunity to do something else is lost during that meeting. So if you calculate those figures that I've given you in front of you over the course of a 12-month period, assuming those figures stay fairly consistent, with 6 people, the overall cost to your team is $195,000. Now, that's not in any budget. You don't see that in the budget. Nobody really considers that. But what I've done is I've actually shown you a hidden cost in your business, or at least in the business of your team. Now, that's a fairly significant figure, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that many of those meetings that went into that calculation were not important. Of course, many of them were. But the question I'd ask you is, have you got $195,000 worth from the meetings and interactions during the course of the year? And I'd suggest probably not. In other words, the question then is twofold. One, how do we increase the quality of meetings to make them more effective? And or two, how do we minimize or reduce the number of meetings that we attend, certainly the non-productive ones, that is. That's the only way that you can actually play with that figure and improve it in terms of its cost effectiveness. Now, consider an organisation. I know we've got some in the broadcast today. Consider an organisation that has 1,000 people. So you've got 1,000 people, which is a sizable organisation, and these figures that I've given you are going to be applied to an organisation of 1,000 people. What that ultimately means is that over the course of 1 year, for that organisation to function in the context of its having meetings, it's costing the organisation $32.5 million of meeting time. Now, if you were an accountant in any organisation and that happened to be a line item and it just had meetings next to it, you would probably be likely to query and say, are we getting our $32.5 million worth, is this worth $32.5 million? So I'm not suggesting we should get rid of meetings. I'm just suggesting that we need to understand that there's a serious cost involved with meetings. So that if you choose to have a meeting, then there must be a good reason for it. And if you choose to have a meeting and you're running it, you need to run it as effectively as you possibly can. So I don't know if anyone's got any questions about that, but my point is that you could actually work that out pretty easily with your own team as a good way of leveraging a need to improve the quality of meetings, both in terms of the meetings you lead and the terms of the meetings that other people attend, because you're not chairing all these meetings, of course. Now, I want to talk about some things that I think you need to take consideration, to take into account to improve the quality of your meetings. Of course, there's been a big trend over the last 20 years to rotate the chair, and the argument there is that by giving everyone a chance to chair the meetings, we're kind of involving everybody. My strong suggestion is not to do that. Now, some of you may be doing that, and I'm more than happy to hear your feedback around that. But the reason I don't think it's a good idea is I believe it's a core responsibility of the team leader. In other words, if you're the leader of the team, and then my view is that that's a core responsibility that you should run. Now, you might say to me, well, yeah, but how do I get other people engaged in the meetings? Well, bear with me. There are some things that you can do and not do that will help engage people. But I don't think it works. And I think the reason is people often dread it when it's their opportunity to chair the meeting. The quality of the meeting is often deteriorates because the person chairing it is inexperienced in how they go about it. You ultimately end up chairing it anyway in a de facto capacity. And I think the whole thing needs to be rethought through. So my view is plonk yourself at the head of the table and chair the meeting, because ultimately that's what you're there for. Happy to hear, yeah, Fraser says, and it's a good question, what about development? Yes, I think there's probably another person in the team who may well be a leader in making, or two. I think that when you're away, by all means, give them the opportunity to chair the meeting. I think that would be good developmental opportunity. But at the end of the day, if you consider, Fraser, the cost of the meetings that I'm talking about, I believe that it's too costly to be tinkering around with that. And I'm not absolutely convinced that people develop necessarily by having a once in a blue moon opportunity to chair a meeting. My view is that they dread it so much, they just want to get through it. And they, I'm not sure that they necessarily get a lot out of it. The trade-off is the development versus efficiency, of course. But I think efficiency should win out here, because I think it is your job to do that. So I understand where you're coming from with that. And if anyone's got other views, I'm happy to hear those. Another thing I'd say to you is that when you have a meeting, try as much as you can to balance up discussion and reporting. Now, our meetings are usually too laden with reporting. So I probably would estimate that 80% of meetings are about reporting, and that the 20% is about discussion. And I think that that's not weighted the way it should be. Often, if people are giving reports at meetings, and I'm not suggesting that's not important, but if that's the whole thrust of it, people just sit there and tune out. It doesn't really contribute a lot. It's a costly way of reporting, by the way. And I think that you could reduce the amount of reporting to some key performance indicators, and you could actually explain that to people, and then free up some time, not in terms of lengthening the meeting time, but reducing the amount of reporting. And then you might say, well, let's discuss X or Y. And you might say, well, what do we talk about? There's a lot of things you can talk about in a team, a lot of things. At the very least, you can ask people how we're travelling as a team. You could actually have a conversation with your team about how effective are we as a team. That's a good conversation to have. And moreover, what can we do to improve our effectiveness? You might argue, you might be able to throw open a conversation about how we might improve the quality of our meetings. That will come up with some great ideas. There's some developmental opportunities for people to talk about. So there's a lot of things you can talk about. There might be a critical incident that occurred the other week, and it's fresh in the minds of everyone, and it's not a blame opportunity, but you can talk about the lessons learnt out of it. There's heaps of things that can be discussed in a meeting. You just have to put your mind to it and try and encourage people to keep their reports short, sharp, and to the point. The critical information will be there anyway, and if you're in any doubt, you can always ask a question publicly and ask people to elaborate on that. So it's all within your grasp to be able to do that. So I think a good meeting, in my view, all things being equal, is 50% reporting and 50% discussion. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. Now, I've just alluded to this. I think it's really important to use critical incidents. Critical incidents are really examples and things that have occurred that affect the team, that are perhaps fresh in the minds of people, that you can use as a conversation piece, not in terms of apportioning blame, but more in terms of what you can learn from it and apply in the future. Now, I think one of the best frameworks that you can use for that is an after-action review. or what's commonly now termed an AAR. An AAR is a simple debriefing process around any critical incident or example. The three key questions in an after-action review are what went well. So even if something was an absolute disaster, you always start with what went well. There's always something that did go well. And then you say what didn't go well, and even if it was an absolute winner, there's a good chance that there was something that didn't go as well as it could. And then the third question that you ask is, what will we do differently next time now that we've learned something from this incident? Now, that is a great opportunity where there's a fresh incident or example where you really want to use it as a learning opportunity. So by all means do that. Now, if you leave it for 6 months, it won't be fresh in people's mind, and of course, they forget about it. So use critical incidents in your meetings, and look, you can set some ground rules around that. You can say to people, look, this is not apportioning blame. We are doing this as a learning opportunity. So I want everyone to be mindful that this is not a witch hunt. We are not attempting to apportion blame for anyone outside this room or inside this room for that matter. But I do believe there's some things that we can take away and learn from this. So preface it like that, and then go into your three questions. What went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently? So that's another thing that I think is important. Now, the other thing I'd say to you is please don't assume that your team members all have very clear understandings of the roles that everyone else around the table has. Big mistake, particularly in a cross-functional team. Now, even in a functional team, there is misunderstandings around what people's roles are. So what I think is important to do, and usually not done very well, is at each meeting, why not give each person around the team, this is where the developmental opportunities come in, give each person around the team an opportunity to share for 5 minutes, a little briefing on what their role is, or what keeps them awake at night might be a good question, or what are some of the core challenges that they face in the role that they do. And that will be very enlightening because everyone around the table will be a little bit more clued up on what their colleagues' roles are. Everyone probably, I say probably, but not always, everyone probably can clarify their own role, but the question really is, does everyone know everyone else's role in the project or whatever it might be? Internal service providers are classics like this. Very few people know what HR does. Very few people know what finance does. Very few people know what governance does in the public sector. And of course, if people don't know, they work on false assumptions, and of course that's where tension and misunderstanding and lack of communication comes in. So ask each team member to share something. So you can do that. You've got 6 people in the team and you're meeting monthly. Well, there's 6 sessions over the course of 6 months, which does lead to development. Now, those of you who work in the outdoor environments, and if you've got any feedback about this, type it in, because if you have stand-up meetings, they work extremely well. I'll tell you why. Because if you're standing up, having a meeting, you can be assured that people will get straight to the point. In other words, people don't want to be standing around for a couple of hours. So what you'll find is a stand-up meeting is great for getting a meeting done reasonably quickly. The other thing, of course, if you're standing up, it's very hard to be fiddling around with an iPad or an iPhone, or it's very obvious when you are. So standing meetings are very, very effective. A typical example of where a standing meeting would be very useful, for example, would be a shift changeover. So one shift finishes and another shift's going to start. So the shift that's finishing will brief the new shift on some of the problems that are occurring and what sort of work needs to be attacked in the next shift. So that can be a very productive type of meeting where a stand-up meeting is all that's needed. So stand-up meetings work extremely well. Do any of you, for example, use stand-up meetings? By all means, I'd love to hear if you do, because my experience is that they can work extremely well. Now, if it's worth meeting, yeah, Fraser says not yet, but could be worth a try. Yeah, look, it is worth a try. Give it a go. See what happens. What do you got to lose? You can always go back to sitting down again, but you can understand the rationale for it, and I think that's the main thing. So have an agenda. Now, if it's worth meeting, it's worth having an agenda. Now, obviously, if it's a spontaneous meeting in the corridor, you're not going to have an agenda. Sometimes things can happen on the spur of the moment. A critical incident might happen, or something's gone amiss. Well, you're not going to have time to have an agenda there. But if it's a set meeting that occurs regularly, then there's no excuse not to have an agenda. But keep the agenda very simple. A couple of things that really work well. Now, it's courtesy. I mean, obviously, if you're going to take people out of work for an hour or 2 hours or whatever, then the least you can do is plan what you're going to be discussing in that meeting and to share that plan with other people in the team. So that's obviously a reason for that. Now, agendas don't have to be complicated. Here's a couple of simple things. If you meet regularly, do not have at the top of the agenda meeting at 9 a.m. Have the time as 9:10 a.m. Why? Well, if you've got 9:10 a.m., then it obviously implies that we're starting at 9:10 a.m. Rather than 9 o'clock, which can kind of mean, 5 to 9 or 10 past 9. So have a peculiar time on your agenda sends a very powerful signal to other people that we expect you to be at this meeting punctually. Now, the other thing I would say, that you do start on time. Don't sit there waiting for people to arrive, because when you do that, what you're doing is rewarding people who turn up late. In other words, they're so really terribly important that we couldn't really do without you, and so we've waited for you. It's kind of like a sugar hit for those people that have turned up late. Now, in terms of the agenda, what you do is you write down the items on the agenda that need to be covered. And here's a couple of clues about that. Always, always, always have the most important items on the agenda first. Why? Because the energy level is at its peak at the beginning of a meeting, even if it happens at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. First thing first, this is the most important, through to the least important. So you first of all prioritise that. And then what you do then is that, now that doesn't mean the first thing might take 2 hours. The first thing could be the most important and it only takes 10 minutes. So there's no necessarily correlation between the time on each item and its importance. But the first thing that's on the agenda is considered to be the most important when energy levels are high. Now, after each agenda item, and it's so easy to do, so it's not going to take you any issue, it's not going to cause you any problems here at all. You put a little number after it. So you put bracket 10, close of bracket. What does that mean? That means that we have scheduled 10 minutes to discuss this item. Now, by doing that, it's a really easy thing to keep people on track. So if somebody's waffling on and we've only got 2 minutes left on that agenda item, it's much easier for you to say to them, without offending them, can you get to the point, because we've only got 2 minutes left on this agenda item. It's a much easier thing to do than to say, look, can you get to the point? People think, oh, well, he or she is not all that interested in what I've got to say. So putting a number after each is extremely valuable, because it really does give you an opportunity to be efficient in terms of the items that are affected. Now, obviously, if the last 2 things on the agenda you didn't get around to, no problem. Remember, they're the least important, so they can go on the agenda at the next meeting, and it's not a problem. You're not rushing through important things at the end of the meeting. So there's a couple of tips that might help you. Of course, if you can get people to include things on the agendas, great. Don't have an item at the end, general business. It's not a good idea, because just people will bring up anything that they want to grandstand on at the end, and and that's not good. If they want to put something, if they want to discuss it, then give them an opportunity to put it on the agenda as an item. So no general business, none of that. It's nonsense. Of course, you can always say at the end, has anyone got anything else they want to raise? That's fine, but don't have it as a single line item, because that just means that people on the spur of the moment will jump in and say whatever they want to say, and if they can't organise and plan themselves, then it's probably not worth hearing. Mind you, things do crop up, and that's why you would ask that question at the end. All right, so now here's a little tip that is extremely useful. Now, you know, I don't know whether you take minutes in your meetings. I'm not sure that this is not what I'm talking about here. But at the end of a meeting, it's a good idea to have, and this is where, again, you can have a developmental opportunity, which Fraser talked about earlier. Who in your meeting is really good at sorting the wheat from the chaff? Who in your meeting is very good at being able to create a summary statement of the key things that have come up in the meeting, and delegate that to them? So ask somebody to summarise the key items that have come out of the meeting. Now, a couple of things will happen here. First of all, that person will be 100% attentive, because they won't want to miss anything. So you're going to have at least one other person besides yourself who's completely attentive in the meeting. Secondly, that person, if they've got that sort of bend, will probably be very good at it, and it'll give them a sense of being able to use their strengths in a meeting. And thirdly, by getting someone to summarise at the end of a meeting, everybody's actually leaving the meeting with some clarity about what has to be achieved. But not only that, there is a sense of accomplishment, bearing in mind what I said, that it's only between meetings that things actually happen. It gives people a sense of accomplishment, that I haven't wasted my time for the last hour, that we've got a couple of key items there that need to be discussed. Now, you don't have to go through in a formal way. Someone just someone just rattles off the key points, and that's that. You can add whatever you want to that at the end as the chair of the meeting. All right, so that works really well, but I very rarely see that done, surprisingly. This chart is simply showing you that what I'd mentioned earlier, that the idea is that people's energy levels are quite high at the beginning of a meeting, and regardless of what time of the day it is. So what that implies, of course, is that the most important items should come first. And as the meeting continues, attention wanes. It's just natural that that's what happens. And so it's just underlining the point that it's really important to talk about the most important things first. So I always suggest that a 1 hour meeting is a good rule of thumb. I think if you can't achieve something in an hour, it's probably really more than a meeting. So hour lots are very good to conduct meetings, but it's up to you how you might do that. What you're seeing on this screen here is the various configurations for meetings. And I just go through this with you. I'll start with theatre and go clockwise, because you've all seen these configurations in your work and outside work. Each of those configurations has its strength and it has its weakness. So let me go through that. So where you've got the theatre style there, where you basically got people sitting in rows with no desk or table in front of them, and you've got a group of people out the front, that's a typical shareholder meeting. So it's great for the conveying of information. So the focal point, of course, is the head table, and people, of course, sitting in the audience can ask questions for clarification or whatever for people sitting at that table. So it's very good for that, but obviously its great weakness is it doesn't give people a good chance to interact who happen to be in the audience. The second configuration, which is what we might call the classroom, the difference, of course, is that everyone has a desk in front of them. So the advantage of this, of course, is that people can conveniently take notes and it will tap out something on an iPad or whatever. You've still got the formality of an expert out the front of the room. So again, the weakness of this is that you don't get interaction between those people sitting at those tables as much as you could, because they're all facing a certain direction. Now, the U shape is very popular for meetings, particularly at functions where you're doing a sort of a team building exercise or something. The great advantage of the U shape is, of course, that you've got a little bit more collaboration going on with the team. So in other words, people can actually eyeball each other, and you'll find that that precipitates more conversation and discussion. Then the next one is the cabaret style, or you could call it the cafeteria style, whichever way you want to go. But ultimately, it's about small teams of people sitting around a table. This is one of my favourites when I'm running a workshop, because it gives people a chance to discuss things in a small, safe group. So wherever you want complete buy-in from a group of people, the cabaret or the cabaret style is the way to go. Now, the banquet style usually is, where you've got a formal arrangement, a formal dinner or something like that. Perhaps there might be some speakers. You've got a head table where all the dignitaries are, and you can see that everyone's sitting around a table. And normally that would be adds a degree of formality to the meeting. And I'm sure we've all attended meetings like that. Now, the final approach, of course, is the conference table, where you've got everyone sitting around a table. I suspect that most of your meetings would be held in that format, and I think it's a good format because people are facing each other. They've also got a space to write and take notes or whatever, or refer to notes, and it's a good approach. There's not too many weaknesses to that approach, frankly, when it comes to dealing with a team. All right, so that gives you some overview of the possibilities around that. So think about the way people, are seated when it comes to the meetings. Now, another thing I'd strongly suggest is that you have a guest speaker. Now, a guest speaker, I don't mean an international speaker or something. What I'm really referring to there is somebody that can add some value to the meeting. So, for example, it might be somebody else inside the organisation that's got an interesting approach. For example, I was just in a meeting today in the venue where I am, and we had a meeting with all of the middle managers, and somebody in that meeting gave a presentation on a training matrix. So they're using this matrix in their own organisation to get people to do multitasks. And so there was a methodology for doing that. You don't need to know much about it, but the point was that they gave a 20-minute overview of what they're doing in their team, and everyone else around the room was riveted because they could then choose to apply that information in their own team or discard it. So, what are the skills around the table? What are the projects people are working on? What expertise could you bring in at different times? Could you ask HR to come in and give a 5-minute overview of what how they might be able to assist your team? There's so many things to do. And so it just adds a flavour, a new variety. Most people are chuffed to be asked to be speakers at their meeting because it gives them a chance to bang their own drum, whatever it might be. And it's a great opportunity, of course, to get some interaction, because after they've given a presentation, you can ask for questions and comments. So consider enriching your meetings with the use of speakers. Now, when you're working in a team environment and when you're chairing a group of people, it's sometimes hard to shut people up, true? So you've got two problems. You've got people that don't say anything, and of course you've got other people that won't shut up. So what do you do with the people that don't shut up? Because you don't want them dominating the meeting, because it's obviously not a good idea. So you use paraphrasing. So when someone has spoken, and as soon as and let's say they've been going on for a little period of time, and you've heard enough, and so has everyone else, and you can see the signals in the room, then how do you shut them up nicely? Well, this is the way to do it. After they draw breath, you simply say, so in other words, your key point is blah, blah, blah. Probably don't say blah, 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 but you know what I mean. Now, if you do that and you do it well and you nail it, it does three things. One, it checks to make sure that you have actually understood the key message that the speaker has made. So that's one reason for doing it. The second reason for doing it is to actually let the person know that you've actually heard them, which isn't bad. And the third reason, and this is the reason I'm getting to in terms of shutting people up, is that you can move the conversation on from that point. So as soon as you've summarised someone's point, you've actually sealed off that key point. In other words, if they want to continue, you can say, no, I've heard it, we've got it, we understand your key message now. Is there anyone else? So I'm now in a position where I can actually control the meeting, but I've done it in a respectful way, having let the person know that I've heard what they've said, or at least checked what I've said, what they've said, and I'm now going to move the meeting on. There's a natural punctuation mark there where you can move people on. So try it. Paraphrasing is excellent. Now, what about the other problem? These are people that you can't get to contribute in a meeting. They're basically shy or introverted or whatever, they just don't want to say anything. Well, the key thing for them is you ask them for their opinion. So you actually do that and don't worry about it. So what you do is you can say something like this. John or Mary, well, you wouldn't use both, but assuming it's John, you'd say, John, is there anything you want to add that hasn't already been covered? Now, of course, John can sit there and say, no, nothing I want to add. But there might be something that John wants to say, and you've given them an opportunity to contribute. Or you might say, Mary, is there anything else that you can think of? And Mary might say, well, actually, there was something, and then off they go. Now, by doing that a couple of times during a meeting, you'll do a couple of things. One is you'll put the quieter ones on notice that they could be picked upon at any time for their opinion. Knowing that, of course, they might actually volunteer their opinion before they're asked. So that's good news. It also sends a very respectful signal to those people that can't shut up that actually the meeting is about everyone and not just you. So it does give everyone a chance. So try that out. It's quite a reasonable thing to do. It's not disrespectful. The person can always say, no, there's nothing I want to add. You could also, what I said before, you've got a balance between task and relationship. What about this as an opportunity? This is an enormously powerful exercise. I've actually been, although I designed it, I'm actually surprised about how incredibly powerful it is. You bring everyone into the meeting and you ask everybody, and that you ask them to write the answers down on an iPad or old-fashioned pen and paper, it doesn't matter. And you ask them basically 5 questions. Well, you can get away with 4 if you wanted. Question 1, what is the one value that's important to you when we meet? So this is, you've got your corporate values and all the rest of it. It's got nothing to do with that. This is how we like to interact in our team. What's one value that's important to you when we meet? Now, I might write down the word respect. So question 2 would be, what does it mean? So in other words, I've got to define what respect means. And I might write down, respect to me means that I feel that my voice is being heard in this team. That's my definition of respect. Someone else might have a different definition. Question 3 is, why is it important? I might write down, respect is important to me because I want to feel that I'm making a worthy contribution to the team. So now I know. And then you don't need to worry about question 5. I think you can get away with the next one. What behaviours, this is where the rubber meets the road, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? Well, I might write down respect to me means that I'm not interrupted even when people disagree with me, and I'm allowed to finish my point. So I'm now after the behaviours that would underpin that value. Now, you get everyone to do that, including yourself, I might add, you're part of the team. And then you basically ask everyone to read out their answers, and you can hear a pin drop. It's very powerful. You'll get some very interesting conversation going on, and you create a charter out of that, and you basically say, this is the way we as a team have chosen to behave with each other. So it's a charter. And of course, as a team leader or a leader, you can hold that team accountable for the team values charter. So that's something you can do. That'll take you about 15, 20 minutes. And what a great way you'll get more out of that than you would on a mindless reporting process sometimes, because it's very insightful. So that's a little thought you might like to try. And the other thing I'd strongly recommend that you do is a win for the week. Now, we go into meetings and we start talking about all the negative stuff, don't we? So why don't we actually start with talking about the things that went well for the last week? Now, if you try this next time you have a meeting, you might be surprised. You might actually find that everyone's just sitting there dumbfounded, all right? Because people aren't attuned to talking about wins. They're attuned to talking about problems, but they're not attuned to talking about wins. So by doing this, you're creating an upward spiral of positivity, not a downward spiral of negativity. It takes 5 minutes, quickly around the table. You do this for 2 or 3 weeks in a row, and ultimately what you'll find is that eventually what will happen is that people will come ready, willing and able to share with you their win for the week. And some of those wins may not be work, they might be personal, and that's okay. So you get to know what's important to people, you have a bit of fun at the beginning of the meeting, it creates a positive vibe. Great way to start a meeting, and why not go there? So you can easily do that as on the next meeting. Okay. So, guys, that's it from me. Do any of you at this stage have any questions that you would like to ask me, or any points raised? I've thrown a huge amount at you in a very short space of time, and I realise it's probably all whizzing around there, but has anyone got something they would like to contribute at this point? Go for your life, because I'm just about ready to move on. While you're thinking about that, what I strongly recommend that you do, and this is your homework, is to implement some of those approaches. So you don't have to do all of those things, of course, it's just too much, it's onerous. But there's probably one thing there that really hits you as a really useful strategy or technique. What I want you to do now is to start the next meeting using that strategy or technique. So you'll get the slides, obviously, you'll get the recording. You can go back over and have a look at that in more detail when you receive it. So that's your homework. And so I strongly urge you to try and improve the quality of your meetings, make them more productive, make them more effective, and you'll get a name for yourself for someone that runs really tight, useful meetings. And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. In fact, there's a lot right with that. So it doesn't look like we've got too much more. No more questions. Okay. So, folks, actually, that's wrong. I've got there the next series starts on the 14th of June. Well, that's gone, so apologies about that. I didn't take that off. But I do have another Lunch and Learn series, so if people are interested, let me know, and we can slot more of your people in to the meetings. So, look, I just wanted to say thank you. I've enjoyed. Whoops, I've gone the wrong way now. I just wanted to say thank you. I've really enjoyed working with you in the last few months. I hope and trust that you've got something useful out of this. I hope and trust that you've applied something differently and it's been useful for you. And I guess the Lunch and Learn series is a very efficient way of being able to, get some key points down quickly and give you a chance to apply them for an hour sitting at your desk watching me on a screen. Thank you for that comment. Let me just open that up and see. Oh, thank you, Fraser. You've been very active today. Thanks, Tim. It's been great. Highly recommended. Look, thanks for that. Yeah, and I apologise. I don't know what happened with the time frame. I'm assuming it's something around daylight saving. I have no idea. But thanks, Megan. Appreciate that feedback. That's very nice and kind of you to say that. So, look, folks, that's it from me. I've enjoyed working with you. I don't think there's much more that we can say at this point. Thanks, Dominique. I appreciate the feedback. Thank you. That helps a lot. And look, I just want to wish you the very best and thank you for your involvement and all the rest of it. And good luck on your leadership journey and all the best. Thanks. And at this stage, we will just sign out if I can do that. Maybe I don't want to go. Here we go. Okay, thanks everyone and all the very best. Thank you and goodbye.